do it. Okay. Hello, everyone. This and that, Monday, the 9th. Thank you for coming. Because Class Unity is going to be looking at Michael Hudson's book for several weeks, I think 3 weeks at least, which means that, it's a 300 some odd page book. So it's for free and there's a link and etc. It's a readable book. So, kudos to his editor as well. The issue, I suppose, at the beginning is that he identifies some main themes in the book and has a little introduction because he wants to sort of get this idea about parasites sort of worked out. So we're going to do that today. That's kind of the first part. The introduction, though, has essentially a diaristic thing. He talks about his life, and not a lot of people lead their books with essentially a brief rundown of things he's done. And I think it's fascinating, partially because, he worked for Chase Bank and a bunch of other things that we don't normally expect with Marxists. But probably the best people who can tackle the economy are people who've actually been sort of on the ground in the city, as it were, in British context, who've done financial work. Most of the people who write the best stuff have been actually, trying to slog it out in the private sector. And there are very few, for whatever reason, people who have spent time more in a public sector, although there are. And I fully expect some good work to come out of the Biden administration, because the Biden administration has a couple of and the Obama administration have had, people, notable heterodox economists lurking here and there, although I don't think there are very many heterodox economists in the Fed. So that's a whole nother set of stories that probably needs to be fixed at some point. Okay, so there we go. That's the kind of, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from the sort of biographical section in the front, and then we'll get to the book itself. He's talking about, his career. He gets sort of sidestepped into archaeology, which is also quite fascinating for a variety of reasons. And I think it's an underserved area relative to economics, so that's even another good thing. And so all of those things are at work. You can see that he does a kind of anthropological deal, that he's attracted to anthropology, and that is also good, mainly because that's sort of an underserved component of most contemporary economics. But the deal is that Marxists are kind of widely read, so more widely read, I think, than the average bear. So during these years, I made proposals to mainstream publishers to write a book warning about how the financial bubble, was going to crash. I guess burst would have been better. They told me that this was like telling people that good sex would stop at an early age. Couldn't I put a good news spin on the dark forecast and tell readers how they could get rich from the coming crash, which is most business press books? I concluded that most of the public is interested in understanding a great crash only after it occurs, not during the run-up when good returns are to be made. Being Dr. Doom regarding debt was like being a premature anti-fascist. So I decided to focus on my historical research instead. In March 1990, I presented my first paper summarizing 3 findings that were as radical anthropologically as anything I'd written in economics. Mainstream economics was still in the thrall of an individualistic Austrian ideology, speculating that charging interest was a universal phenomena dating from Paleolithic individuals advancing cattle, seeds, or money to other individuals. But I found that the first and by far the most major creditors were the temples and palaces of Bronze Age Mesopotamia, not private individuals acting on their own. charging a set rate of interest seems to have diffused from Mesopotamia to classical Greece and Rome around the 8th century BC or BCE. The rate of interest in each region was not based on productivity, but was set purely by simplicity for calculation in the local system of fractional arithmetic. 1/60th per month in Mesopotamia, and later 1/10th per year for Greece and 1/12th for Rome. You could see how that was easily created relative to calendars. Today, these ideas are accepted within the Assyriological and archaeological disciplines. In 2012, David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years, tied together the various strands of my reconstruction of the early evolution of debt and its frequent cancellation. We're going to read that book. In the early 1990s, I had tried to write my own summary, but was unable to convince publishers that the Near Eastern tradition of biblical debt cancellation was firmly grounded. 2 decades ago, economic historians and many biblical scholars thought that the Jubilee year was merely a literary creation, a utopian escape from practical reality. I encountered a wall of cognitive dissonance at the thought that the practice was attested to in increasingly detailed clean slate proclamations. Each region had its own word for such proclamations. Sumerian Margi, meaning return to the mother, Ama, condition, a world in balance. Babylonian Misharum, as well as Andurarum, from which Judea borrowed as Deror, and Hurrian Shudutu. Egypt's Rosetta Stone refers to this tradition of amnesty for debts and for liberating exiles and prisoners. Instead of a sanctity of debt, what was sacred was the regular cancellation of agrarian debts and freeing of bondservants in order to preserve social balance. Such amnesties were not destabilizing, but were essential to preserving social and economic stability. So before we look at Michael Hudson directly, I just wanted to I included in today's little thing is questions about, we're familiar with the cinematic zombies, and that zombies do exist in nature, where an organism overtakes another organism's body and changes it to ensure its survival and replicate itself. It's a virus-like in that sense. And there are tremendous, grotesque examples of, some insects, some other sorts who just sort of take over, appropriate the bodies of other entities. And then, of course, there are parasites that occur in the human body, which is a little frightening and weird, and have a lot to do with how we interact with nature. How much do we consume, or do we cook things, in fact? And then, of course, there is the movie, Bong Joon-ho's movie, Parasite. The film's title was selected by Bong, and it served a double meaning. Had to convince the film's marketing group to use it because the story is about a poor family infiltrating and creeping into the rich house. It seems very obvious that Parasite refers to the poor family, and I think that's why the marketing team was a little hesitant. But if you look at the other way, you can say that the rich family, they're also parasites in terms of labor. They can't even wash dishes. They can't drive themselves, so they leech off the poor family's labor. So both are parasites. And this is very, as we recall, Hegelian, right? Master-slave relations. That is, they are codependent in that particular way. So without further ado, we'll get on to Michael Hudson's book, The Parasite, the Host, and Control of the Economy's Brain. I hope you can see this. Biological usage of the word parasite is a metaphor adopted from ancient Greece. Officials in charge of collecting grain for communal festivals were joined in their rounds by their aides. Brought along to the meals by these functionaries at public expense, the aides were known as parasites, a non-pejorative term for meal companions from the roots para, that is beside, and sitos, that's meal. By Roman times, the word came to take on the meaning of a superfluous freeloader. Well, you could also say they might have been food tasters. The parasite fell in status from a person helping perform a public function to become an uninvited guest who crashed a private dinner, a stock character in comedies worming his way in by pretense and flattery. Medieval preachers and reformers characterized usurers as parasites and leeches. Ever since, many economic writers have singled out bankers as parasites, especially international bankers. And you can see how that can weave its way into an anti-Semitic trope. Passing over into biology, the word parasite was applied to organisms such as tapeworms and leeches that feed off larger hosts. To be sure, leeches have long been recognized as performing a useful medical function. George Washington and also Stalin were treated with leeches on their deathbeds, not only because bleeding the host was thought to be a cure, much as today's monetarists view financial austerity, but also because leeches inject an anticoagulant enzyme that helps to prevent inflammation and thus steers the body to recovery. The idea of parasitism as a positive symbiosis is epitomized by the term host economy, one that welcomes foreign investment. Governments invite bankers and investors to buy or finance infrastructure, natural resources, and industry. Local elites and public officials in these economies typically are sent to the imperial or financial core for their education and ideological indoctrination to accept this dependency system as mutually beneficial and natural. The home country's educational cum ideological apparatus is molded to reflect this creditor-debtor relationship as one of mutual gain. India is a good example. Smart versus self-destructive parasitism in nature and in economies. In nature, parasites rarely survive merely by taking. Survival of the fittest cannot mean their survival alone. Parasites require hosts, and a mutually beneficial symbiosis often results. Shares of its growth. A financial analogy occurred in the 19th century when high finance and government moved closer together to fund public utilities, infrastructure, and capital-intensive manufacturing. Especially in armaments, shipping, and heavy industry, banking was evolving from predatory usury to take the lead in organizing industry along the most efficient lines. This positive melding took root most successfully in Germany and its neighboring Central European countries under public sponsorship. Across the public political spectrum, from state socialism under Bismarck to Marxist theorists, bankers were expected to become the economy's central planners by providing credit for the most profitable and presumably socially beneficial uses. A three-way symbiotic relationship emerged to create a mixed economy of government, high finance, and industry. For thousands of years, from ancient Mesopotamia through classical Greece and Rome, temples and palaces were the major creditors, coining and providing money, creating basic infrastructure, and receiving user fees as well as taxes. The Templars and Hospitallers led the revival of banking in medieval Europe, whose Renaissance and progressive era economies integrated public investment productively with private financing. To make this symbiosis successful and free, immune to special privileges and corruption, 19th century economists sought to free parliaments from control by the property classes that dominated their upper houses. Britain's House of Lords and senates throughout the world defend the vested interests against the more democratic regulation and taxes proposed by the lower house. Parliamentary reform extended the vote to all citizens, was expected to elect governments that would act in society's long-term interest. Public authorities would take the lead in major capital investments in roads, ports, and other transportation, communications, power production, and other basic utilities, including banking, without private rent extractors intruding into the process. The alternative was for infrastructure to be owned in a pattern much like absentee landlordship, enabling rent-extracting owners to set up toll booths to charge society whatever the market would bear. Such privatization is contrary to what classical economists meant by a free market. They envisioned a market free from rent paid to a hereditary landlord class and free from interest and monopoly rent paid to private owners. The ideal system was a morally fair market in which people would be rewarded for their labor and enterprise, but would not receive income without making a positive contribution to production and related social needs. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and their contemporaries warned that rent extraction threatened to siphon off income and bid up prices above the necessary cost of production. Their major aim was to prevent landlords from reaping where they have not sown, as Smith put it. Toward this end, their labor theory of value, and this will come up in chapter 3, aimed at deterring landlords, natural resource owners, and monopolists from charging prices above cost value, opposing governments controlled by rentiers. Recognizing how most great fortunes have been built up in predatory ways through usury, war lending, and political insider dealings to grab the commons and carve out burdensome monopoly privileges led to a popular view of financial magnates, landlords, and hereditary ruling elite as parasitic by the 19th century. Epitomized by the French anarchist Proudhon's slogan, property as theft. Instead of creating a mutually beneficial symbiosis with the economy of production and consumption, today's financial parasitism siphons off income needed to invest and grow. Bankers and bondholders desiccate the host economy by extracting revenue to pay interest and dividends. Repaying a loan, amortizing, or killing it shrinks the host. Like the word amortization, mortgage, dead hand of past claims for payment contains the root mort, or death. A financialized economy becomes a mortuary when the host economy becomes a meal for the financial free luncher that takes interest, fees, and other charges without contributing to production. The great question in a financialized economy, as well as in biological nature, is whether death of the host is a necessary consequence or whether a more positive symbiosis can be developed. The answer depends on whether the host can remain self-steering in the face of a parasitic attack, taking control of the host's brain or government. Modern biology provides the basis for a more elaborate social analogy to financial strategy by describing the sophisticated strategy that parasites use to control their hosts by disabling their normal defense mechanisms. To be accepted, the parasite must convince the host that no attack is underway. To siphon off a free lunch without triggering resistance, the parasite needs to take control of the host's brain, at first to dull its awareness that an invader has attached itself, and then to make the host believe that the free rider is helping rather than depleting it, and is temperate in its demands, only asking for the necessary expenses of providing its services. In that spirit, bankers depict their interest charges as a necessary and benevolent part of the economy, providing credit to facilitate production and thus deserving to share in the surplus it helps create. Insurance companies, stockbrokers, and underwriters join bankers in aiming to erase the economy's ability to distinguish financial claims on wealth from real wealth creation. Their interest charges and fees typically eat into the circular flow of payments and income between producers and consumers. To deter productive regulations to limit this incursion, high finance popularizes and promotes a free value view that no sector exploits any other part. Whatever creditors and their financial managers take is deemed to be fair value for the services they provide. Otherwise, bankers ask, why would people or companies pay interest if not to pay for credit deemed necessary to help the economy grow? Bankers and also their major customers, real estate, oil and mining, and monopolies, claim that whatever they're able to extract from the rest of the economy is earned just as fairly as new direct investment in industrial capital. You get what you pay for is used to justify any price, no matter how ridiculous. It is circular reasoning playing with pathologies. The most lethal policy sedative in today's mainstream orthodoxy is the mantra that all income is earned. This soporific illusion distracts attention from how the financial sector diverts the economy's nourishment to feed monopolies and rent-extracting sectors surviving from past centuries, now supplemented by yet new sources of monopoly rent, above all in the financial and money management sectors. This illusion is built into the self-portrait that today's economies draw to describe their circulation of spending and production. That is, NEPA, the National Income and Product Accounts, as presently designed, the NEPA neglect the distinction between productive activities and zero-sum transfer payments where no overall production or real gain takes place, but income is paid to one party at another's expense. The NIPA, the NEPA, duly report the revenue of the finance, insurance, and real estate, FIRE sector, and monopolies as earnings. These accounts have no category for what classical economists called economic rent, a free lunch in the form of income siphoned off without a corresponding cost of labor or enterprise. Yet a rising proportion of what the NIPA report as earnings actually derive from such rents. The Chicago School's Milton Friedman adopted the rentier motto as a cloak of invisibility. There is no such thing as a free lunch, the Tinstoffel. That means that there are no parasites taking without giving an equivalent value in return, at least no private sector parasites. Only government regulation is condemned, not rent extraction. In fact, taxation of rentiers, the recipients of free lunch income, coupon clippers living off government bonds or rental properties or monopolies, is denounced rather than endorsed. As was the case for Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and their 19th century free market followers. David Ricardo aimed his rent theory at Britain's landlords while remaining silent about the financial rentiers, the class whose activities John Maynard Keynes playfully suggested should be euthanized. Landed proprietors, financiers, and monopolists were singled out as the most visible free lunchers, giving them the strongest motive to deny the concept in principle. Familiar parasites in today's economy include Wall Street's investment Wall Street's investment bankers and hedge fund managers who raid companies and empty out their pension reserves. Also, landlords who rack rent their tenants, threatening eviction if unfair and extortionate demands are not met, and monopolists who gouge consumers with prices not warranted by the actual costs of production. Commercial banks demand that government treasuries or central banks cover their losses, claiming that their credit steering activity is necessary to allocate resources and avoid economic dissolution. So here again, we find the basic rentier demand: your money or your life. A rentier economy is one in which individuals and entire sectors levy charges for the property and privileges which they have obtained, or more often, that their ancestors have bequeathed. As Honoré de Balzac observed, the greatest fortunes originated from thefts or insider dealings whose details are so lost in the mists of time that they've become legitimized simply by the force of social inertia. At the root of such parasitism is the idea of rent extraction, taking without producing, permitting an excess of market price to be charged over intrinsic cost value, lets landlords, monopolists, and bankers charge more for access to land, natural resources, monopolies, and credit than what their services need to cost. Unreformed economies are obliged to carry what 19th century journalists called the idle rich, 20th century writers called robber barons and the power elite, and Occupy Wall Street called the one percenters. To prevent such socially destructive exploitation, most nations have regulated and taxed rentier activities or kept such potential activities, above all basic infrastructure, in the public domain. But regulatory oversight has been systematically disabled in recent years. Throwing off the taxes and regulations put in place over the last 2 centuries, the wealthiest 1% have captured nearly all the growth in income since the 2008 crash. Holding the rest of society in debt to themselves, they have used their wealth and creditor claims to gain control of the election process and governments by supporting lawmakers who untax them and judges or court system that refrain from prosecuting them. Obliterating the logic that led society to regulate and tax rentiers in the first place, think tanks and business schools favor economists who portray rentier takings as a contribution to the economy rather than as a subtrahend from it. History shows that a universal tendency for rent extracting conquerors, colonizers, or privileged insiders to take control and siphon off the fruits of labor and industry for themselves. Bankers and bondholders demand interest. Landlords and resource appropriators levy rents, and monopolists engage in price gouging. The result is a rentier-controlled economy that imposes austerity on the population. It's the worst of all worlds. Even while starving economies, economic rent charges render them high cost by widening the margin of prices over intrinsically socially necessary costs of production and distribution. Sound familiar? Reversing classical reform since World War II, and especially since 1980, the great reversal of classical industrial era reform ideology to regulate or tax away rentier income occurred after World War I. Bankers came to see their major market to be real estate, mineral rights, and monopolies, lending mainly to finance the purchase and sale of rent-extracting opportunities in these sectors. Banks lent against what buyers of land, mines, and monopolies could squeeze out of their rent-extracting toll booth opportunities. The effect was to pry away the land rent and natural resource rent that classical economists expected to service the natural tax base. In industry, Wall Street became the mother of trusts, creating mergers into monopolies as vehicles to extract monopoly rent. Precisely because of free lunch, that is, rent, was free, if governments did not tax it away, speculators and other buyers sought to borrow to buy such rent-extracting privileges. Instead of a classical free market ideal in which rent was paid as taxes, the free lunch was financialized, that is, capitalized into bank loans to be paid out as interest or dividends. Banks gained at the expense of the tax collector. By 2012, over 60% of the value of today's homes in the United States is owed to creditors, so that most rental value is paid as interest to banks, not to the community. Homeownership has been democratized on credit. Yet banks have succeeded in promoting the illusion that the government is the predator, not bankers. The rising proportion of owner-occupied housing has made the real estate tax the most unpopular of all taxes. The property tax cuts do not simply leave more rental income available to pay mortgage lenders. The result of a tax shift off of property is a rising mortgage debt by home buyers paying access prices bid up on bank credit. Popular morality blames victims for going into debt, not only individuals, but also national governments. The trick in this ideological war is to convince debtors to imagine that general prosperity depends on paying bankers and making bondholders rich, a veritable Stockholm syndrome in which debtors identify with their financial captors. Today's policy fight is largely over the illusion of who bears the burden of taxes and bank credit. The underlying issue is whether the economy's prosperity flows from the financial sector's credit and debt creation or is being bled by increasingly predatory finance. The pro-creditor doctrine views interest as reflecting a choice by impatient individuals to pay a premium to patient savers in order to consume in the present rather than in the future. This free choice approach remains mute about the need to take on rising levels of personal debt to obtain home ownership, an education, and simply to cover basic break-even expenses. It also neglects the fact that debt service to bankers leaves less to spend on goods and services. Less and less of today's paychecks provide what the national accounts label as disposable income. After subtracting FICA withholding for taxes and forced savings for Social Security and Medicare, most of what remains is earmarked for mortgages or residential rent, healthcare, and other insurance, bank and credit charges, car loans, and other personal credit, sales taxes, and the financialized charges built into the goods and services that consumers buy. Biological nature provides a helpful analogy for the banking sector's ideological ploys. A parasite's toolkit includes behavior-modifying enzymes to make the host protect and nurture it. Financial intruders into a host economy use junk economics to rationalize rentier parasitism as if it makes a productive contribution, as if the tumor they create, the tumor they create, is part of the host's own body, not an overgrowth living off the economy. A harmony of interests is depicted between finance and industry, Wall Street and Main Street, and even between creditors and debtors, monopolists and their customers. Nowhere in the NEPA, the National Income and Product Accounts, is there a category for unearned income or exploitation. The classical concept of economic rent has been censored by calling FIRE industries, that is, finance, real estate, and monopolies industries. The result is that about half of what the media report as industrial profits are FIRE sector rents, that is, finance and insurance and real estate rents. And most of the remaining profits are monopoly rents for patents, that is, headed by pharmaceuticals and information technology and other legal privileges. Rents are conflated with profit. This is the terminology of financial intruders and rentiers seeking to erase the language and concepts of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and their contemporaries depicting rents as parasitic. The financial sector's strategy to dominate labor, industry, and government involves disabling the economy's brain, that is, the government, and behind it, democratic reforms to regulate banks and bondholders. Financial lobbyists mount attacks on public planning, accusing public investment and taxes of being a deadweight burden, not as steering economies to maximize prosperity, competitiveness, rising productivity, and living standards. Banks become the economy's central planners, and their plan is for industry and labor to serve finance, not the other way around. Even without so conscious an aim, the mathematics of compound interest turns the financial sector into a wedge to push large sectors of the population into distress. The buildup of savings accruing through interest that is recycled into new lending seeks out ever new fields for indebtedness, far beyond the ability of productive and industrial investment to absorb, as you'll see in Chapter 4. Predators claim to create wealth financially simply by asset price inflation, stock buybacks, asset stripping, and debt leveraging. Lost from sight in this exercise in deception is how the financial mode of wealth creation engorges the body of the financial intruder, at odds with the classical aim of rising output at higher living standards. The marginalist revolution looks nearsightedly at small changes, taking the existing environment for granted and depicting any adverse disturbance as being self-correcting, not a structural defect, leading economies to fall further out of balance. Any given development crisis is said to be a natural product of market forces, so that there's no need to regulate and tax the rentiers. Debt is not seen as intrusive, only as being helpful, not as capturing and transforming the economy's institutional policy structure. A century ago, socialists and other progressive era reformers advanced an evolutionary theory by which economies could achieve their maximum potential by subordinating the post-feudal rentier classes, that is, landlords and bankers, to serve industry, labor, and the commonweal. Reforms along these lines have been defeated by intellectual deception and often outright violence by the vested interests, Pinochet Chile style, to prevent the kind of evolution that classical free market economists hope to see, reforms that would check financial, property, and monopoly interests. So we're brought back to the fact that in nature, parasites survive best by keeping their host alive and thriving. Acting too selfishly starves the host, putting the free luncher in danger. That is why natural selection favors more positive forms of symbiosis, with mutual gains for host and rider alike. But as the volume of savings mounts up in the form of interest-bearing debt owed by industry and agriculture, households, and governments, the financial sector tends to act in an increasingly short-sighted and destructive ways. For all its positive contributions, today's high and low finance rarely leaves the economy enough tangible capital to reproduce, much less to feed the insatiable exponential dynamics of compound interest and predatory asset stripping. In nature, parasites tend to kill hosts that are dying, using their substance as food for the intruder's own progeny. The economic analogy takes hold when financial managers use depreciation allowances for stock buybacks or to pay out as dividends instead of replenishing and updating their plant and equipment. Deferred maintenance, for example. Tangible capital investment, research and development, and employment are cut back to provide purely financial returns. When creditors demand austerity programs to squeeze out what is owed, enabling their loans and investments to keep growing exponentially, they starve the industrial economy and create a demographic, economic, political, and social crisis. This is what the world is witnessing today from Ireland to Greece. Ireland with bad real estate debt that has become personal and taxpayer debt, and Greece with government debt. These countries are losing population to accelerating emigration as wages fall, suicide rates rise, lifespans shorten, and marriage and birth rates plunge. Failure to reinvest enough earnings in new means of production shrinks the economy, prompting capital flight to less austerity-ravaged economies. Who will bear the losses from the financial sector's overfeeding on its industrial host? The great political question confronting the remainder of the 21st century is which sector will receive enough income to survive without losses degrading its position, the industrial host economy or its creditors? For the economy at large, a real and lasting recovery requires constraining the financial sector from being so short-sighted that its selfishness causes a system-wide collapse. The logic to avoid this a century ago was to make banking a public function. The task is made harder today because banks have almost become impenetrable conglomerates with attached Wall Street speculative arbitrage activities and casino-type derivative bets to the checking and saving account services and basic consumer and business lending, creating banks too big to fail, PBTF. Today's banks seek to prevent discussion of how overlending and debt deflation cause austerity and economic shrinkage. Failure to confront the economy's limits to the ability to pay threatens to plunge labor and industry into chaos. In 2008, we watched a dress rehearsal for this roadshow when Wall Street convinced Congress that the economy could not survive without bailing out banks, bankers, and bondholders, whose solvency was deemed a precondition for the real economy to function. The banks were saved, not the economy. The debt tumor was left in place. Homeowners, pension funds, city and state finances were sacrificed as markets shrank and investment and employment followed suit. Savings since 2008 has taken the form of paying down debts to the financial sector, not to invest to help the economy grow. This kind of zombie savings depletes the economy's circular flow between producers and consumers. It bleeds the economy while claiming to save it, much like medieval doctors. Extractive finance leaves economies emaciated by monopolizing their income growth and then using its takings in predatory ways to intensify the degree of exploitation, not to pull the economy out of debt deflation. The financial aim is simply to extract income in the form of interest, fees, and amortization on debts and unpaid bills. If this financial income is predatory and if capital gains are not earned by one's own labor and enterprise, then the 1% should not be credited with having created the 95% of added income they have obtained since 2008. They have taken it from the 99%. If banking really provides services equal in value to the outsized wealth that's created for the 1%, why does it need to be bailed out? When the financial sector obtains all the economic growth following bailouts, how does this help industry and employment whose debts remain on the books? Why weren't employment and tangible capital investment bailed out by freeing them from the debt overhead? If income reflects productivity, why have wages stagnated since the 1970s while productivity is stored and the gains extracted by banks and financiers, not labor? Why do today's national income and product accounts, NEPA, exclude the concept of unearned income, that is economic rent, that was the main focus of classical value and price theory? If economics is really an exercise in free choice, why have proselytizers for the rentier interest found it necessary to exclude the history of classical economic thought from the curriculum? The free luncher's strategy is to sedate the host to block these questions from being posed. This sensorial mirage is the essence of post-classical economics. numbed by pro-rentier, anti-government, anti-labor neoliberals. Their logic is designed to make it appear that austerity, rent extraction, and debt deflation is a step forward, not killing the economy. Future generations may see the degree to which this self-destructive ideology has reversed the Enlightenment and is carving up today's global economy as one of the great oligarchic takeovers in the history of civilization. As the poet Charles Baudelaire quipped, the devil wins at the point where he is able to convince the world that he doesn't exist. And that's the kind of invisibility that exists. Now, the next section is not that long, but there was a crash. I think we can get through this one and then I'll stop. The 12 themes of this book. The book has 12 themes. A nation, number one, a nation's destiny is shaped by two sets of economic relationships. Most textbooks and mainstream economists focus on the real economy of production and consumption based on the employment of labor, tangible means of production, and technological potential. This tangible economy, number one, is wrapped in a legal and institutional network of credit and debt, property relations, and ownership privileges, while economy number two is centered on the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. This debt and ownership economy transforms its economic gains into political control to enforce payments of debt and to preserve property and natural resource or monopoly rent privileges, typically inherited. Interest and rents are transfer payments from economy one to economy two, but mainstream economics depicts all income as being earned productively, even by absentee landlords and Wall Street speculators receiving rentier overhead and interest. The operative fiction is the assumption that everyone earns in proportion to what they contribute to production. So NEPA, that is the National Income and Product Accounts, treat whatever revenue these individuals are able to extract as a contribution to GDP, gross domestic product, as if their exorbitant incomes reflect high productivity. Their output is defined as equal to their revenue, so GDP should really be thought of as gross national cost. There seems to be no such thing as economic parasitism or unnecessary cost of living and doing business. No free lunch is recognized, and hence no economy number two that does not contribute productively to economy number one. Number two, theme number two, today's banks don't finance tangible investment in factories, new means of production, or research and development. The productive lending that is supposed to provide borrowers with the means to pay off their debt. Banks largely lend against collateral already in place, mainly real estate, 80% of bank loans, stocks and bonds. The effect is to transfer ownership of these assets, not produce more. Borrowers, theme number three, borrowers use these loans to bid up prices for the asset they buy on credit. Homes and office buildings, entire companies buy debt leveraged buyouts, and infrastructure in the public domain on which to install toll booths and charge access rents. Lending against such assets builds up their prices. This is so-called asset price inflation. Theme number four, paying off these loans with interest leaves less wage or profit income available to spend on consumer goods or capital goods. This debt deflation is the inevitable successor to asset price inflation. Debt service and rent charges shrink markets, consumer spending, employment, and wages. Theme number five, austerity makes it harder to pay debts by shrinking markets and causing unemployment. This is why John Maynard Keynes urged euthanasia of the rentier if industrial capitalism is to thrive. He hoped to shift the focus of fortune seeking away from banking, implicitly from its major loan markets and absentee landlordship and privatization of rent extracting monopolies. Theme number six, mainstream policy pretends that economies are able to pay their debts without reducing their living standards or losing property, but debts grow exponentially faster than the economy's ability to pay as interest accrues and is recycled, while the new bank credit is created electronically. The magic of compound interest doubles and redoubles savings and debt balances by purely mathematical laws that are independent of the economy's ability to produce and pay. Economies become more debt leveraged as claims for payment are concentrated in the hands of the 1%. Debts that can't be paid won't be. The question is, how won't they be paid? There are two ways not to pay. The most drastic and disruptive way, euphemized as business as usual, is for individuals, companies, or governments to sell off or forfeit their assets. The second way to resolve matters is to write down debts to a level that can be paid. Bankers and bondholders prefer the former option and insist that all debts can be paid, given the will to do so. That is, the will to transfer property into their hands. This is the solution that mainstream monetarist economists, government policy, and the mass media popularize as basic morality. But it destroys economy number one to enrich the 1% who dominate economy number two. Theme number 8. A bubble economy may postpone the collapse if banks lend on easier terms to enable borrowers to bid up prices for real estate and other assets. This inflation becomes the only way creditors can be paid as the economy becomes increasingly more debt-ridden. It enables debtors to pay their creditors by borrowing more against collateral becoming higher priced. Indeed, new lending and debt must grow exponentially to sustain this kind of bubble, just as new subscribers are needed to sustain a chain letter or Ponzi scheme. After 2001, rising asset prices tempted home buyers to borrow or to buy assets, paying the interest by borrowing against their asset price gains. But what seemed at first to be a self-inflating perpetual motion machine led to a crash. When current income did not cover the interest charge, by 2007, speculators stopped buying and started to sell off property, crashing its price. The debts were left in place, causing negative equity. Theme number 9. Banks and bondholders oppose debt write-downs to bring down debt in line with earnings and historical asset valuations. Creditor demands for payment run the economy in the interest of financialized economy number 2, instead of protecting the indebted production and consumption economy number 1. The effect is to drive both economies bankrupt. The financial sector, that is the 1%, backs oligarchies. Eurozone creditors recently imposed technocrats to govern debt-strapped Greece and Italy and block democratic referendums on whether to accept the bailouts and their associated austerity terms. This policy dates from the 1960s and 70s, when the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the U.S. government began backing creditor-friendly third world oligarchies and military dictatorships. Every economy is planned. The question is, who will do the planning, banks or elected governments? Will planning and structuring the economy serve short-term financial interests, that is, making asset price gains and extracting rent, or will it promote the long-term upgrading of industry and living standards? Banks denounce public investment and a tax shift off wages onto rentier wealth as the road to serfdom. But strong public regulation is needed to prevent economies from polarizing between debtors and creditors, and to block the financial sector from imposing austerity and sending the economy on the road to debt peonage. We've heard that. The financial sector's drive to increase its political power has a fatal fiscal dimension. Whatever economic rent that remains untaxed is free to be pledged to the banks as interest. Banks therefore advocate untaxing real estate, natural resource rent, and monopoly price gouging. This is the opposite from the classical policy of taxing and deprivatizing economic rent and asset price, that is, capital gains. Classical value and price theory demonstrates that a rent tax does not increase prices, but is paid out of rent, absorbing the excess of price over intrinsic cost value. That was the policy aim of free market economists, from the physiocrats at Adam Smith through John Stuart Mill and the progressive era. By the late 19th century, it was called socialism, which originally meant freeing markets from the political legacies of feudal privileges to enclose the colony and privatize public infrastructure. Those are the 12 themes. Next time, we will read about the financial sector's rise to power. And I hope that you found at least this little moment interesting. Let's see at this particular moment if there are any questions in the chat. lower than parasites, brain worms, ant brain, fungal worms. We will note that RFK Jr. has a dead worm somewhere in his head, in his brain. Of course, the brainworm he probably got was from consuming either raw meat or meat badly prepared, since he seemed to be interested in all kinds of strange natural consumption of one kind or another. And we could say it's karmic in that sense, that is, to eat things that are not normally eaten. Although in some cultures I think the Koreans have only just put the prohibition on eating dog, at least at an official level. So whatever that means. Any questions? Brickbats?
I like the parasite analogy and the, fully exploring it too.
Oh, indeed.
My sense is, these parasites are ones that, if given the chance, they would take the host down.
Oh, indeed. Well, they don't have a real sense of the whole. I mean, they've taken over the brain, but they don't sort of have a real sense of how fully integrated into the host.
So there's 12. Yeah, I guess I'll have to kind of go back through the list and familiarize myself with it.
Well,
and look for that as.
Yeah, he's trying to build up. It's really hard to describe an entire economy, but essentially he's describing how the bubble happens, and it happens because of various things that are quite natural. They're natural features, but that doesn't mean that we should accept them as that's the way things can always be. I think there's ways of intervening, and I think you could see there are various moments where you can return to a more classical model, and a classical model does include Marx in terms of thinking, that things can work out better.
I'm still kind of not convinced that regulation will counter the bad parts.
Well, yeah, it's Heinlein who regulates the regulators, right?
Right. Yeah.
No, it's always a problem. I mean, it is ultimately still a question of what counts as the commons, what counts as democracy, all those other political things that are really need to be integrated with this. It can't simply be that, people who are better at, maximizing rent or whatever should be also allowed to make decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that kind of reminds me of, I guess it's Glass-Steagall, where there's supposed to be this separation between investment and regular banking.
Well, you can see how they became more collusive, right? Or at least what an impediment regulation was to meet their ends.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And they certainly didn't see it as a patriotism to keep these sectors separate.
I'm going to have to go back and reread this section because there was a couple of phrasings about, like, the crisis where, it put it in terms of, there's this rise in productivity, but workers aren't getting, wages are stagnant, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That I look forward to more sort of in-depth analysis.
It is, you create new categories, some of which are have less accountability, because that's sort of what the class unity folks were looking at with this last set of readings. There were things that were done that is sleight of hand, right?
Yeah.
there were some things that just weren't accountable. And so when you started screwing around with that stuff and it wasn't really backed by anything, once things started to have to be cleared, the you would discover, there's no money to cover this.
Right. Yeah, there's no liquidity, huh?
That's right. It's just a liquidity crisis. And the liquidity crises are, what Keynes is talking about. It's still the same damn problem. It's just now we've created all these new sort of instruments to obscure reality. And it's only
Yeah.
because people weren't paying attention to it. And, you sort of expect the banks to act responsibly, and they don't. They just don't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You can expect them to do the wrong thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a cultural thing. I mean, they don't want to talk about it being a cultural thing, but it's a cultural thing.
Oh, like machismo, or
Yeah. Well, it's just this little culture, the bank culture. And then, of course, on top of that, it's investment bank culture.
greed is good.
That's what it is.
Sorry about all the noise.
Well, I don't know if everyone's seen Wall Street or, all the variations on, I mean, we could spend all our time looking at, capitalist narratives. Although I suppose The Big Short is as closest you get to trying to create, kind of a juxtaposition of sort of reality and uh, the complexity of all these other little functions going on at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to read Fountainhead, but I do want to, get some exposure to you know, some of the better of the other side's arguments, kind of.
Well, I mean, it has certain things that sort of have certain types of ideals, but is certainly cynical about outcomes. Although the Fountainhead is such a wonderful the original one is such a cute little film. Because
Oh, it's a movie, huh?
well, it analogizes Frank Lloyd Wright and juxtaposes that against sort of land speculation and other things, and it has all the Hollywood stuff going on because Gary Cooper was having an affair with what's her name. They had all of these things going on, and it was really campy in terms of the imagery.
I bet that's worth a watch. I'll check it out.
Oh, it's worth watching. I mean, it's kind of it's a little over the top, but
Talking about Patricia Neal.
yeah, Patricia Neal, that's it.
She was married to Roald Dahl at some point, I think.
Oh yes, true that. But she was having this hot thing with I guess Gary Cooper or whatever.
I remember her from The Day the Earth Stood Still more than anything else.
Hey, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's overblown in the sense of, taking on a certain moral responsibility, and it's sort of strange in in the abstractions that are sort of built on it. You know,
So the next section is financial sector's rise to power. I'm curious how far back it goes.
well, it goes back to Keynes. No, 1066.
1066. There we go.
No, I mean, it collapses the history to get up to the modern period. But yeah, we should be able to get this done tomorrow. It's not very long. Um, all right. So we'll do chapter 1 tomorrow, the next section tomorrow. Let me thank everyone for their attention. And writing workshop is at the top of the hour.
Thank you.
Joe, you can shut off the live stream. Oh, unless I've been given power to, yes,